Through Your Eyes, written by Avril Sabine. Dedication. To my long-suffering kids. It can't be that time, I'm sure I just sat down at the computer. Book description. A girl, a boy in a coma, and a diary. How far would you be willing to go to save the life of a stranger? Life seems determined to throw one problem after another at 16-year-old Brenna. She feels like her life is disintegrating before her eyes and has no idea how to sort it out. Her best friend lives in another state, her parents are constantly arguing, her younger sister keeps prying into her things, and she wants to break up with her boyfriend without it causing her more problems at school. The only person she has to talk to about everything is a boy in a coma. And she's terrified he might never wake. Chapter 1. Brenna Reardon's fingers tightened on the note when a gust of wind tore at her. She wrapped her arms around herself, pulling her jacket close as the cold breeze strengthened. The action caused the straps of her school backpack to pull against her shoulders. It looked like spring would be late coming to Brisbane this year. She guessed she'd know in a fortnight. Maybe spring would have Travis thinking about beaches instead of motorbikes. She mentally shook her head. Who was she kidding? There wasn't much chance of that. She sped up, wanting to get out of the wind. As she entered the hospital, a child ran into her. Brenna barely managed to jump out of the way of a flying drink, but the crumpled note was knocked from her hand. An irate mother dragged away the wailing child while Brenna stared at her note soaking in the dark brown liquid. It uncrumpled as the liquid soaked into it, and the ink made artistic squiggles across the paper. Brenna bit back the scream of frustration that wanted to escape. She closed her eyes with a sigh. Her day wasn't going to plan. But lately, none of them had. Some days she wished she could step out of her life and into someone else's. Just for a few moments. You all right, honey? Brenna opened her eyes to stare into the concerned face of a cleaner, who plopped her mop on the spreading mess. She nodded. Yeah, I'm just. She stopped and gestured towards the elevators. Visiting. She started to move away, then glanced back. Thanks. She dredged up a smile. The cleaner nodded and returned the smile, her mop moving back and forth over the mess. The soaked paper was irretrievable. Brenna's steps slowed. She frowned as she tried to recall the details Adrian had scrawled. They hadn't been much clearer to read before their drowning. Maybe she should text Adrian and ask him which room Travis was in. She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket, then thought of how low she was on credit. As usual. Maybe she'd try and find him first. Tucking her phone away, she headed for the elevators. Several minutes later, she entered a room, coming to a complete halt when she saw the patient in the bed was hooked up to machinery. Clearly the wrong room. She'd give it one more try to find the correct room before she asked Adrian for directions again. Turning to leave the room, she nearly ran into a nurse. Well, this is a nice change. I was beginning to think poor Zach wasn't going to get any visitors. The nurse hurried past her and picked up the chart hanging at the foot of the bed. Brenna hovered not far from the doorway, uncertain what to do. Should she leave? Did the nurse expect her to stay? She watched as the nurse took his blood pressure and temperature and recorded them in the chart. The nurse strode towards her with a friendly smile. All done. You can have him back. I put magazines in the top drawer a couple of days ago. Another patient left them behind. You could read them to him. There are a lot of studies that show the sound of a person's voice, or even music, helps coma patients. It's rare for them to remember what's said, but a few recall being spoken to. Brenna's gaze darted from the nurse to the patient, wondering what she should say. She had to say something. The nurse clearly waited for a comment. Thank you. It was all she could think of, but it must have been enough because the nurse smiled again. "You're welcome." The nurse briskly left the room. Brenna hesitated, her gaze drawn to the doorway. Would the nurse ask her why she was leaving already? It wasn't like she had any experience with hospitals. She didn't have a clue how things were done. Maybe she'd wait a few minutes and then leave. She stepped close to the bed and looked down at the man lying there. Her mouth dropped open when she saw how young he was. Only a couple of years older than her. His dark brown hair spread out around his head on the pillow, his skin was pale and tubes and leads were attached to him. "Why don't you have any visitors?" Brenna frowned. And how had he ended up in a coma? She really should try and find Travis's room. He was expecting her. She checked the time on her phone. Maybe a few minutes wouldn't hurt. It wasn't like he'd be alone. Adrian was sure to be with him. She sighed. She had to be honest with herself. The real reason she didn't want to face Travis was because she had to find a way to break up with him. A way that wouldn't cause problems for her at school. She'd never been good at confrontations. Telling someone you wanted to end it while they were in hospital with a concussion and a broken arm, from coming off a motorbike, wasn't the time or place. She continued to stare at the young man, wondering who he was and how he'd ended up in hospital. And where were his friends? His family. She glanced towards the drawers beside his bed, shifting from one foot to the other. "Well, maybe I'll read one of those magazines to you." She looked at the name above his bed, Zach. She opened the drawer, pulled them out, and laughed wryly as she turned to him. "How ironic. I really hope this isn't your usual choice of magazines. You can't imagine how sick I am of motorbikes. Dirt bikes in particular." She dropped the 3 magazines on top of the drawers. Sick of them has got to be an understatement. There's been times I've wanted to dismantle Travis's motorbike. She frowned. Did he hear? Understand? Or was her voice only a background noise? She turned to the drawer, looking for something else. There was a large hardcover notebook and a card. She pulled the card out first and skimmed through the words, expecting a sympathy card she could sit on his bedside drawers. She stared at the card, then read it again. It still said the same. "What a bitch. Seriously, if you like this, Tracy, I think you're an idiot." She groaned. "Not that I can talk." That was such a tactless comment. "A good thing you're in a coma and won't remember what I've said." She closed her eyes with another groan. "I'm gonna shut up now before I choke on my foot." With a deep breath, she opened her eyes to stare at the card. "Or maybe I better stick to reading things to you." Her gaze was momentarily drawn to Zach, perfectly still in the bed. What was it like in a coma? Was it like dreaming? Or was it nothingness? A shiver went through her, and she quickly drew her attention away from that uncomfortable thought. She cleared her throat. "Dear Zach, I'm sorry to hear about your parents and the car accident. I did try and visit you a few times, but you know how I feel about hospitals. I spent more than enough time in them when I was a kid. I know this probably isn't the best time to do this, but we did decide to keep things honest between us. I hope you get well, but I'm sure you'll understand when I say things between us are over. All the best, Tracy." Brenna closed the card and slid it in the drawer. She wasn't certain what to say. Did you comfort a person who couldn't hear you? It felt wrong not to say something. "I'm sorry she ditched you. But maybe you're better off without her. I mean, a person who's going to run at the first sign of trouble isn't worth worrying about. And to break up with you through a card is cruel." Brenna sighed. "Not that I can talk. Seriously, there has to be a nicer way to break up with someone than that. If only she could figure it out." At least she now knew how not to do it. After another glance at Zach, she stared at the open drawer in front of her. Let's see if you've got anything else I can read you. Something better than motorbike magazines and cards from ex-girlfriends. Brenna reached into the drawer and pulled out the large notebook. It didn't quite shut, and when she flicked through the pages she saw photos, drawings and bits and pieces stuck in amongst the pages of writing. She closed the book and hugged it to her as she stared at Zach. She was so tempted. It was wrong. Beyond wrong. There was no way she could do that to him. Unless. She opened the book again and took a quick look at the first page. It wasn't just a journal with basic notes. It was far more detailed than that. Brenna slowly closed the diary and slid it back in the drawer. Her hand rested on it a moment before she drew away, picking up one of the magazines with a grimace. Before she had a chance to open the magazine, her phone rang. She read the display. It was Travis. Hi. Where are you? School was out ages ago. I thought you'd be here by now. Brenna bit back the words that wanted to spill at his tone of anger and impatience. What's your floor and room number? You're lost, aren't you? Where are you? I'll send Adrian to find you. I'm not lost. She started to explain but decided to simplify. I lost the note Adrian gave me. Holding her phone to her ear with her shoulder, she grabbed a pen she'd spotted in the drawer and scrawled the direction on her wrist. Thanks. Hurry up. They'll have me discharged with the amount of time you're taking. Okay. She glared at the phone when Travis disconnected. She tried to remind herself he must be in pain. Not to mention he hated sitting around doing nothing. She brought her thoughts to a sudden halt as she realized she was making excuses for him again. As soon as she slid her phone in her pocket and the magazines in the drawer, she turned to Zach. I guess her voice trailed off. What? See him later? Visit again? She didn't even know him. I hope you get well soon. She strode to the door and stopped to look back at him. Why had no one visited him? She forced herself to step into the corridor but couldn't resist one last glance back at Zach. She couldn't stand here all day. She had to find Travis. Sliding up the sleeve of her jacket, she looked at the directions. She'd got part of the number correct at least. She knew she should hurry, but her steps slowed the further she went from Zach's room. Everyone knew you shouldn't run through a busy hospital. She knew it was a lame excuse the moment she thought it. There was no way she could justify the 10 minutes it took her to reach Travis's room, other than procrastination. She paused in the doorway and took a deep breath. The two boys in the room were busy talking and didn't notice her. Brenna stared at Travis and wondered, for probably the 20th time that day, what on earth she was doing with a boyfriend like him. Okay, sure, he was absolutely gorgeous in the grade above her, and his best friend Adrian, who'd been kept back a year at school, was 18 with a car and license. So yeah, she knew some of the reasons she'd been drawn to him. But it wasn't enough to make her stick around. She needed to find the right opportunity to end things. And okay, she was occasionally tactless and sometimes spoke without thinking, but even she knew now wasn't the right time. Both the boys were nearly 6 foot tall, but where Adrian was slim enough to be called gangly, Travis had broader shoulders and a solid build. They were blonde and blue-eyed. Adrian's hair was baby fine and impossible to do anything with, while Travis's hair was thick with a slight wave that looked good even after he ran his fingers through it. That was another thing that annoyed Brenna. Her hair was a reddish-brown and no matter what she tried to do with it, nothing worked. She usually resorted to leaving it hang straight and kept it at shoulder length. Who was she kidding? Everything was starting to annoy her about Travis. They never managed time alone. He spent more time with his motorbike than her. And he expected her to go with him to his uncle's property, where he and Adrian kept their dirt bikes. At nearly 3 hours a round trip from Brisbane, there went most of the day. Their conversation suddenly sank in. Brenna stepped into the room. "Are you crazy? You fractured your arm. You have to wear the cast for 6 weeks. Travis looked at her. "About time you made it. And a fracture isn't a break. 5 weeks will be plenty for it to heal." "Then why does the doctor want you in the cast for 6 weeks? Travis shrugged. "I've been planning this camping trip all year. I'm not about to let a fracture get in the way." Adrian nodded in agreement. "Yeah, you can't go camping with a cast on." "I doubt a doctor would remove the cast for your convenience," Brenna said. Travis stared at the cast for a moment. "I'm sure I can figure some way to get rid of it." Adrian gestured towards the cast. "We could try bolt cutters. You'd think they'd be able to cut through a cast if they can cut chain links." Brenna looked in disbelief at the two of them, as they discussed the best way to remove the cast early. Why on earth had she agreed to visit him today? She slid her phone out of her pocket and checked the time. "I've got to go or I'll be late home." "You just got here. Adrian can drop you home once the doctor says I can go." "I'm surprised you don't check yourself out." "I considered it." Travis grinned. "But he hasn't given me a script for painkillers yet. I'm not about to leave without that." "I'll see you at school on Monday." Brenna turned to leave before she said something she shouldn't. "Bren." She kept her back to him, hesitating. "What?" She barely managed to keep the impatience from her voice. "I thought we were doing something tomorrow." She turned to face him, her brain frantically trying to come up with an excuse. "I'm sorry." Nearly giving up, an excuse came to her. "My parents grounded me this weekend because my room was a mess." Knowing he expected it, she dashed across the room, forced a smile, gave him a quick kiss and retreated before he could argue. "I'll see you Monday." She hurried from the room. When she reached the bus shelter, she reminded herself it would have to be soon. Monday. She'd end things Monday. She wrapped her arms around herself as she checked the bus timetable. 15 minutes. A glance showed her the warm spot against the shelter wall was taken. Spring couldn't arrive soon enough. On the bus trip home, Brenna pulled out a couple of her school books to start on her homework. If the bus was running on time, she'd be home before her parents, but if not, she could say she'd been at the library doing her homework. It always paid to have an excuse ready when you weren't where you were meant to be. And it beat trying to think up one on the spot.